Early days. In the 1920s and 1930s, professional basketball operates without the dedicated coaching staffs that later become standard. Teams rarely employ more than a manager or part-time strategist, leaving most in-game decisions to captains on the floor. Because substitutions are limited and rotations practically non-existent, the players themselves determine tactics in real time, often adjusting defenses or calling rudimentary offensive sets mid-possession. Semi-professional circuits across the Midwest and East Coast normalize this structure, with player leaders acting simultaneously as scorers, organizers, and disciplinarians. The lack of formal coaching reflects a league still searching for identity, as professional basketball lags behind baseball and football in both attendance and credibility. Rule books remain thin, refereeing inconsistent, and strategies improvised, which means the chaos of player-led decision-making is not seen as unusual. What later appears outdated is, at the time, a necessary adaptation to limited resources and unstable franchises. This foundation sets the stage for how the NBA, when officially formed in 1946, inherits both the improvisational spirit of barnstorming ball and the precedent of athletes doubling as tacticians. The conditions are therefore in place for the eventual rise of formalized player coaches like Bill Russell. Dollar Bill. In 1966, Bill Russell accepts the role of player coach for the Boston Celtics, making him the first black head coach in major American professional sports. At 6'10" and already a five-time MVP, Russell continues anchoring the defense while simultaneously managing rotations and addressing the press. The Celtics record back-to-back championships in 1968 and 1969 under his dual leadership, extending the dynasty beyond the Auerbach era. Because he balances rebounding averages above 18 per game with the responsibilities of orchestrating huddles, Russell demonstrates that one person can sustain both physical dominance and strategic authority. The strain becomes visible in his final season, when Boston posts a 42-40 record and barely secures playoff qualification. Russell compensates through motivational speeches and calculated adjustments to minutes, but the roster no longer sustains consistent excellence. Even in decline, the model validates the feasibility of a player coach guiding a contender to championships while carrying on-court production. His retirement in 1969 closes the Celtics' unmatched run of 11 titles in 13 years, and it establishes the precedent for star-led coaching experiments that later decades would attempt to replicate. The next era belongs to younger stars trying to imitate Russell's balance of leadership and output. Wilt. In 1973, Wilt Chamberlain accepts a player-coach role with the San Diego Conquistadors of the American Basketball Association, but his arrival carries more headlines than production. At 7-1, and already holding the NBA records for 100 points in a game and 50.4 points per season, he is expected to transform the expansion franchise. A contract dispute with the Los Angeles Lakers, however, prevents him from suiting up, so he stands confined to the sideline. Attendance spikes initially because of his name recognition, but the novelty fades once fans realize he never enters the floor. Chamberlain's coaching tenure becomes defined by absence as much as strategy. Reports circulate that he frequently skips practices, delegating preparation to assistants and relying on his stature to maintain authority. The team finishes below 500, and his one-year experiment ends without renewal. Because his reputation rests on unmatched individual statistics rather than organizational discipline, Chamberlain demonstrates how celebrity status alone cannot substitute for consistent leadership. The failure of San Diego's gamble contrasts directly with Boston's Russell-led success, setting the stage for how later franchises evaluate the risks of tying coaching duties to star icons. Slick Leonard Bobby. Slick Leonard enters the Indiana Pacers' orbit in the late 1960s, bridging roles as both player and coach during the ABA's chaotic growth. In 1968, he briefly holds player-coach status, a transitional job that reflects the franchise's limited budget and the league's willingness to experiment. Leonard's final playing minutes coincide with his assumption of bench authority, giving him immediate control of rotations and strategy while still wearing a uniform. This overlap illustrates how fragile roster depth was in the ABA, where injuries or retirements forced managers to improvise solutions. Once retired from playing, Leonard shifts full-time to the sideline and produces results that anchor the Pacers as an ABA powerhouse. His teams capture 3 ABA championships between 1970 and 1973, a record that cements Indiana as the league's most stable contender. Leonard's coaching style features aggressive substitutions and visible energy, with frequent technical fouls underscoring his intensity. Attendance in Indianapolis rises with the Pacers' success, and Leonard's reputation becomes synonymous with both the ABA's competitiveness and its volatility. The Pacers' dominance under Leonard sets the stage for the league's merger discussions and contrasts sharply with the shorter, less successful player-coach tenures around him. Dolph Schayes. Dolph Schayes, a 12-time All-Star and 1955 NBA champion with the Syracuse Nationals, finishes his playing days by gradually sliding into a coaching role. By the late 1960s, he transitions with the franchise as it relocates and rebrands into the Philadelphia 76ers, carrying both his credibility as a former star and his tactical discipline. Schayes inherits responsibility during a turbulent period when the league's power balance shifts and rosters must adjust to expansion and retirements. His ability to bridge eras makes him one of the more stable figures in an otherwise unsettled coaching market. As Philadelphia's head coach, Schayes records a career winning percentage of 55%, a mark that places him firmly above league average across his tenure. He is tasked with managing Wilt Chamberlain during the center's early Philadelphia years, a challenge that requires balancing Chamberlain's unprecedented production with the needs of the broader roster. Schayes navigates the transition from the Nationals' grinded-out style to the faster, more athletic 76ers teams of the 1960s. His coaching stint reflects how former stars often carried the dual burden of credibility and expectation, shaping both their players' performances and the franchise's identity. Schayes' steady hand closes one chapter of the Nationals' legacy while setting the conditions for Philadelphia's future success under new leadership. Larry Costello. Larry Costello, a 6-time All-Star guard for Philadelphia in the 1960s, earns recognition for his precision set shot and disciplined floor management. He assumes a short-lived player-coach role during the later years of his career, bridging a roster that still leaned on veteran guard play with a league shifting toward faster, more athletic styles. Costello's methodical approach reflects the NBA's earlier half-court emphasis, where guards orchestrated possessions with deliberate shooting and structured spacing. His brief dual role demonstrates the challenges of maintaining playing responsibilities while dictating rotations and strategy from the sideline. After his playing career ends, Costello builds a stronger reputation entirely from the bench by guiding the Milwaukee Bucks in the early 1970s. In 1971, he coaches a roster featuring Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson to a 66-16 record and an NBA championship, cementing Milwaukee's place in league history. His disciplined, defense-first schemes carry over from his playing philosophies, giving structure to a roster that thrived on talent and execution. Costello's short stint as player coach is less remembered than his later achievements, but it illustrates the transitional moment where on-court leaders increasingly ceded authority to full-time coaches. The Bucks' emergence under his watch marks the broader shift away from dual roles and toward specialized sideline leadership. Pete Maravich rumors. During the early 1970s, the Atlanta Hawks feature Pete Maravich, a guard averaging over 23 points per game in his first 4 seasons. Local speculation suggests that his strong personality and high-profile scoring might one day lead him into a player-coach role. The rumor gains modest traction because several franchises had recently experimented with the model, hoping to unify locker room leadership and tactical decision-making. However, the Hawks' strained relationship with Maravich and disputes over his role in the offense undermine any chance of such a transition. The mere suggestion reflects how star power occasionally intersected with organizational desperation. Ownership friction ultimately ends the discussion before it can advance. The Hawks trade Maravich to New Orleans in 1974, and by that point, the league is largely abandoning dual responsibilities in favor of specialized coaching staffs. The Maravich rumors therefore serve as a marker of how rare the role had become, moving from a common solution in the 1950s and 1960s to an impractical consideration by the mid-1970s. With franchises investing more in television contracts and long-term stability, The risks of overloading a star player outweighed the potential savings. The Hawks' missed experiment with Maravich illustrates how the NBA shifted permanently away from player coaches as a standard practice. Dave DeBusschere. In 1964, the Detroit Pistons appoint Dave DeBusschere as player coach at only 24 years old, making him the youngest head coach in NBA history. Already recognized for his rebounding balance and two-way play, he inherits a roster struggling to reach 500. The dual role demands constant adjustments, as DeBusschere must track substitution patterns while logging more than 30 minutes per night on the floor. Detroit's record under his tenure remains below break-even, reflecting both the challenges of youth and the difficulty of managing strategy while defending elite forwards. It was less a failure of effort than of timing and structure. By 1966, the Pistons move on from the experiment, and DeBusschere eventually transitions fully into his playing prime. Traded to the New York Knicks, he becomes the defensive anchor of their championship teams in 1970 and 1973, averaging double-digit rebounds and earning all-defensive first-team honors 6 consecutive seasons. His coaching stint, however, underscores the limits of asking even disciplined young stars to manage dual duties against increasingly complex offenses. The Pistons' decision illustrates why franchises gradually narrowed coaching roles to specialists, leaving DeBusschere remembered less for his sideline work than for his defensive dominance in New York. The league's next wave of experiments would again test whether exceptional players could balance both responsibilities. Lenny Wilkens. In 1969, the Seattle Supersonics assigned Lenny Wilkens as player coach, giving their all-star guard responsibility for both orchestrating the offense and shaping overall strategy. He manages the role for 3 consecutive seasons, a rarity by that era as front offices increasingly favored full-time coaches. By the 1971-72 campaign, Wilkens delivers 47 wins, then the best mark in franchise history, while still averaging over 17 points and 8 assists per game. The dual responsibilities reveal his composure, as he maintains steady production on the floor while directing rotations from the sideline. It stands as one of the most effective player-coach stretches in league history. After retiring from playing, Wilkens transitions entirely into coaching, a path that eventually secures his place in the Hall of Fame as both a player and coach. He becomes known league-wide for his calm sideline style, contrasting with the fiery reputations of many contemporaries. His success with the Supersonics provides early proof that leadership rooted in composure can yield consistent results across multiple decades. Seattle AS progress under Wilkens bridges the experimental era of player coaches with the professionalized coaching model of the modern NBA, where stability and long-term planning dominate decisions. That bridge sets the stage for the final wave of player-coach experiments in the 1970s. Tom Heinsohn. When Bill Russell retires in 1969, the Celtics require a bridge between their dynastic run and the uncertain roster that follows. Tom Heinsohn, a 6-time champion forward from the Russell years, steps into that space. There are brief discussions of him taking on a dual role similar to Russell's, but Heinsohn never logs a minute as a player while officially coaching. The overlap exists only in talk, not in box scores, yet it highlights how closely the Celtics consider continuity after losing the league's first black head coach. It reflects how teams in transition often lean on familiar names to stabilize identity. By the early 1970s, Heinsohn transitions fully into coaching, guiding Boston to titles in 1974 and 1976, and cementing his legacy outside his playing career. His presence on the sideline ensures that the Celtics system, motion offense, disciplined defense, unselfish ball movement, remains connected to the Russell era. While not a true player coach in practice, Heinsohn's case still fits the lineage because it shows how franchises blurred the lines between playing and coaching to preserve culture. That blurred line narrows further as the 1970s progress, making Heinsohn one of the last figures associated with the hybrid role before the concept fades almost entirely. Bob Cousy. In 1969, the Cincinnati Royals attempt to revive interest by naming Bob Cousy their player coach. Cousy, already a Hall of Fame point guard with 6 championships in Boston, is 41 years old when he accepts the role. After 6 years away from the court, He activates himself for 7 games, mostly as a promotional stunt designed to draw fans to the struggling franchise. His production is minimal, just 0.7 points per game across those appearances. But the move succeeds in generating headlines and ticket sales. It is one of the clearest examples of the player-coach model being used for marketing rather than strategy. Cousy's brief comeback underscores how far the concept of player-coach had shifted from necessity to novelty by the late 1960s. In earlier decades, limited staffs made the role practical. By the Royals' experiment, it functions almost entirely as a gimmick. The stunt also foreshadows how franchises would lean on nostalgia and celebrity to sustain relevance during lean years. Cousy's final stat line does not matter as much as the fact that a team could use his legacy to stay in conversation. That reliance on image over on-court contribution points to why the player-coach role soon disappears, clearing the way for specialized coaching staffs in the 1970s. Dick Motta talk. By the early 1970s, Dick Motta establishes himself as a demanding, detail-driven coach for the Chicago Bulls, but he occasionally appears in press discussions about reviving the player-coach concept. Writers point to his reputation for rigorous conditioning drills and hands-on oversight as qualities that might have fit the dual role in an earlier era. However, despite speculation, Motta never seriously entertains the idea of putting on a uniform while running a sideline. The NBA at this point begins emphasizing clear boundaries between management and labor, which makes a coach doubling as an active player less realistic. The absence of Motta from any formal player-coach experiment underscores how league priorities are shifting away from improvisation and toward organizational standardization. Owners, general managers, and the emerging players' union prefer defined responsibilities because they reduce conflict over authority and contract structure. Motta's name surfaces as a thought experiment in newspapers, but the lack of action shows how rapidly the model is disappearing. By the mid-1970s, the player-coach is functionally extinct, and mentions of Motta highlight that shift rather than a genuine possibility. This marks the turning point where the NBA clearly separates coaching strategy from player execution, laying the groundwork for the modern coaching profession. The press fascination with Motta fades as the decade continues, and his legacy centers instead on leading the Washington Bullets to the 1978 championship. Yet the brief conversation illustrates the last stage of cultural memory for the player-coach role, a concept tied more to nostalgia than to viable team planning. Writers occasionally framed it as a curiosity rather than a trend. The discussion of Motta as a hypothetical player-coach effectively signals the end of the line for the tradition. The growing professionalism of the league cements the transition, and by the late 1970s, the player-coach exists only as a historical reference point. Reggie Harding. In the mid-1970s, reports circulate that Reggie Harding, a 7-foot center with prior NBA experience, might attempt a comeback as a player-coach in the American Basketball Association. Harding had last played in the NBA in 1968, averaging 6.1 points and 6.7 rebounds per game across 6 seasons, and his name resurfaces in smaller market press outlets as the ABA struggles to fill rosters. Because the league operates with unstable franchises and looser regulations than the NBA, the idea of Harding doubling as both player and coach gains momentary traction. However, no franchise ever formalizes the arrangement, and Harding never records another professional game. The Harding rumors reflect the broader instability of the ABA during its final years. Teams like the San Diego Conquistadors and Memphis Sounds face constant turnover in both players and management, so speculative moves generate headlines even without execution. A player-coach model appears attractive to struggling owners because it consolidates payroll, but the absence of follow-through shows the limits of improvisation in a collapsing system. Harding's name becomes shorthand for the unstructured environment of the mid-70s ABA, where rumors often outpaced actual signings. This moment illustrates how far the player-coach concept had fallen from its earlier NBA legitimacy. Harding's candidacy never moves beyond speculation, precisely because neither league maintains the organizational stability to support it. Writers sometimes treated the idea as emblematic of the ABA's desperation. By the 1976 merger, the player-coach role is no longer viable at any level of professional basketball. The disappearance of Harding from serious consideration bridges into the NBA-ABA unification, when standardized contracts and defined hierarchies leave no room for such experiments. Dave Cowens. In 1978, Boston Celtics center Dave Cowens, a 6'9" former league MVP averaging 18.2 points and 14.4 rebounds across his career, takes the unusual step of naming himself head coach. Boston sits in organizational transition after the departure of Tommy Heinsohn and the brief tenure of Satch Sanders, so Cowens assumes the dual role midway through the season. Because he remains an all-star caliber player at age 30, the experiment attracts wide coverage as one of the last true player-coach arrangements in league history. Cowens manages the Celtics through 68 games as player-coach and records a 27-41 mark, the team's worst record since 1950. The workload proves unsustainable because Cowens must balance playing over 30 minutes per night with game planning, substitutions, and locker room management. He resigns from the coaching role after just one season, admitting the responsibilities conflict with maintaining his performance as a player. Despite stepping down, Cowens continues to serve as Boston's on-court leader, guiding a younger roster that will later transition toward the Larry Bird era. His brief coaching stint underscores the impracticality of combining modern player demands with head coaching responsibilities. By the late 1970s, scouting, travel, and media pressures expand to levels that make dual roles unworkable. Cowens' attempt, therefore, marks a turning point. It is the final, credible instance of an active all-star functioning as head coach. The end of his experiment creates the historical gap into which new full-time coaching specialists emerge, linking directly to the Celtics' future under Bill Fitch in 1979. Paul Silas. During the late 1970s, Paul Silas, a 6.7 forward, known for averaging double-digit rebounds across a 16-year career, emerges briefly in press reports as a candidate for a player-coach role with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Silas, a two-time All-Star and three-time NBA champion with Boston, brings credibility as a locker-room stabilizer and defensive specialist. The idea surfaces as ownership looks for ways to cut costs while also preserving veteran leadership, a formula that had precedent in the 1960s and early 1970s. The arrangement never materializes, largely because the workload demanded by the modern NBA already exceeds what a veteran player can manage. By the late 1970s, scouting reports, travel obligations, and league expansion widen the responsibilities of coaching into a full-time profession. Silas continues to contribute on the court, but the Cavaliers ultimately pivot to a traditional coaching hire, reflecting the organizational shift away from dual roles. His candidacy is less a serious proposal than a remnant of an older model. Silas's near appointment highlights the decline of the player-coach experiment, which had once been viewed as practical but is now treated as outdated by most front offices. As franchises expand staffs to include assistants, trainers, and scouts, the notion of a single figure controlling both the playbook and the floor diminishes. Silas remains important as a symbol of that transitional moment, respected enough to be considered, but part of an era where the structure no longer supports such overlap. The Cavs' decision to bypass the experiment connects directly to the league's broader move into specialized full-time coaching leadership in the 1980s. Final holdover Dave Cowens' brief tenure as Boston's player coach in 1978-79 stands as the final recognized example of the role in NBA history. At age 30, he posts 14.2 points and 8.1 rebounds per game while guiding the team to a 27-41 record in a transitional season. His decision to quit after only 1 year reflects the strain of balancing tactical preparation with the physical demands of playing. Because his experiment follows immediately after Russell, Heinsohn, and Cousy, Cowens becomes the figure most often cited as the endpoint of the lineage. By the early 1980s, collective bargaining agreements and union voices formalize opposition to player coaches, citing conflicts of interest in salary negotiation and contract authority. Franchises also begin to expand coaching staffs, with specialized assistants, film coordinators, and trainers rendering the dual role redundant. The NBA quietly shifts policy until the position is effectively disallowed, with explicit prohibitions later written into league rules. The ban is less about tradition and more about structural efficiency. The shift illustrates how the professional game outgrows practices that once made sense in a smaller, financially vulnerable league. Where teams once saw financial savings and continuity in combining roles, they now view it as incompatible with modern operations. Cowens' one-year experiment therefore becomes both the last holdover and the closing chapter in a nearly 4-decade practice. With his exit, the league permanently separates coaching and playing, setting the stage for the specialized bench hierarchies of the modern NBA. Today, modern NBA economics and labor rules eliminate any possibility of the player-coach model returning. The salary cap, introduced in 1984, creates strict accounting that requires every contract to be classified as either player or coach, not both. Collective bargaining agreements reinforce the division by mandating separate negotiations for on-court personnel and staff, ensuring no overlap in responsibilities. Because unions represent players and not coaches, the league views any hybrid role as a direct conflict of interest. Team structures have also expanded far beyond what existed in the 1960s or 1970s. Most franchises now employ between 6 and 10 assistant coaches, along with video analysts, skill development coordinators, and dedicated specialists for offense, defense, and player wellness. This scale makes it impractical for an active player to absorb the responsibilities of managing rotations, preparing game plans, or handling media obligations. Even with advanced analytics and communication tools, the workload far exceeds what one individual could balance while playing full minutes. The division of labor is now the central feature of a modern NBA bench. Occasional speculation surfaces in media or among fans, usually tied to dominant stars with leadership reputations. In the 2010s, LeBron James jokes about becoming a player coach, but both league officials and team executives immediately dismiss the idea as impossible under current rules. What once functioned as a practical cost-saving solution is now remembered as a historical quirk. The role exists today only as myth and nostalgia, with no realistic chance of returning in a league defined by specialization and contractual boundaries. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks for watching.